Ordinary human dating. It's enjoyable and it serves an important purpose. But when a human dates an artificial mate, there is no purpose, only enjoyment. And that leads to tragedy.
Neato! A Marilyn Monroe bot!
You're a real dreamboat.
Billy every teen.
Harmless fun? Let's see what happens next.
Billy, do you want to walk your dog?
No thanks, Mom. I'd rather make out with my Monroe bot.
Billy, do you want to get a paper route and earn some extra cash?
No thanks, Dad. I'd rather make out with my Monroe bot.
Billy, do you want to come over tonight? We can make out together.
Gee, Mavis, your house is across the street. That's an awfully long way to go for making out.
Did you notice what went wrong in that scene? Ordinarily, Billy would work hard to make money with his paper route. Then he'd use the money to buy dinner for Mavis, thus earning a slim chance to perform the reproductive act. But in a world where teens can date robots, why should he bother? Why should anyone bother? Let's take a look at Billy's planet a year later. Where are all the football stars? And where are the biochemists? They're trapped in the soft, vice-like grip of robot lips. All civilization was just an effort to impress the opposite sex. And sometimes the same sex. Now, let's skip forward 80 years into the future. Where's Billy?
Farewell.
The next day, Billy's planet was destroyed by aliens. Have you guessed the name of Billy's planet? It was Earth. Don't date robots!
Brought to you by Space Poop.
Don't date robots. Hello, I'm Grenville Kent, and this actually is a serious topic, judging by the amount of academic interest that has been in it over the last particularly 3 to 5 years. Engineering and law, philosophy, ethics, media effects, and a little bit of theology have considered very seriously the question of sex with robots or robotic sex. And it's part of a vast post-human technological future that a lot of people are imagining. In some ways, it's already familiar to us from the movies. And you can probably think of a number of examples of that, particularly, for example, Maria from the film Metropolis, much loved by Madonna as well, if you have that kind of memory. There's also that one, which, do you know what film that is? I know you can't respond, but just see if you can get ahead of me. It's called Electric Dreams, Forever in Electric Dreams, and it describes a young, I think, architect and a cellist who lives through the wall, and he accidentally tips champagne into his computer and improves its consciousness, probably the first time champagne ever did that, and they have a love triangle. It's quite chaste and innocent, but from the 80s. That one's a familiar one, Blade Runner. That's kind of a sweet film describing the techno future with Robin Williams playing the role in Bicentennial Man. That's a familiar one, AI by Spielberg. A kind of a sweet film about a young, emotionally or socially disordered man who sees quite a bit of help or love or comfort in a real doll, a young guy who eventually overcomes his emotional issues, and she dies, not to give away the plot, and he's able to conduct a relationship with a real woman. Whether that's realistic, that part or not, I'm not sure, but it's a sweet film. He even goes to church with her, and the people there are actually very understanding and gentle about it. Her, where you fall in love with Siri's kind of sophisticated older sister. The Stepford Wives, where women are murdered and replaced by very submissive 1950s housewife robots. Of course, good old Austin Powers, all 3 films. And this has received some serious scholarly attention from the futurists, because in all of them, Austin has to overcome these women as temptations, these fembots who can fire bullets out of their nipples and are controlled by Dr. Evil. Please don't say I resemble him. I know, but only in looks. And they are to kind of destroy the superhero, and he must resist the temptation of that. Ex Machina, quite a dark, interesting, more recent film. And of course, if you've watched Westworld, that's perhaps the most sophisticated and certainly long-form portrayal of robotic humanity, and raises quite a few moral and human dilemmas, as we'll see later on. Now Getting Realistic, that's a documentary about the lives of the users of sex dolls and the profile that they fill. You probably already have a perception that they tend to be older, shyer, perhaps not as sociable, and a few other characteristics which we'll discuss. The next few images may be a little bit disturbing. You're welcome to fast forward or switch off for a minute or look away. This is Real Doll. This is their presentation at a Vegas convention. And this is the reality of their factory. There's the woman, and there's all the technology controlling her. They can't actually stand, the dolls, or walk. There's their creator, Matt Mullen, quite a thoughtful guy. There's the production line, which, yeah, I find these images a bit disturbing, but I show them because I think we probably should be a little bit disturbed at a dismembered woman arriving in a box, or a famous president's wife being imitated in latex, and or people just being reduced perhaps to body parts. There are male dolls as well, though they're far in the minority. And you can see the different bits that you can order to personalize your robot. What lies beneath, you can see it there. A metal frame, a skeleton, and a lot of padding. And there are also many other dolls made in Asia and Europe. We'll talk about those a little more later. So we already are familiar with the screen dreams about this kind of future, sex with robots. And in fact, IMDb lists 89 films with the title Artificial Female in there somewhere. And there's also a lot of contemporary novels. For example, Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me and Jeanette Winterston's Frankenstein are very, very, very interesting. Margaret Atwood, The Heart Goes Last, has a guy testing a sex robot with terrible results for his part of his body. And it would be fair to say that these media presentations are driving the community's expectation. Rebecca Gibson, in her chapter in Desire in the Age of Robots and AI, says this: fictional depictions help move the Overton window. That's regarded as a kind of a window of acceptability that can shift from an extreme on one side to an extreme on the other, or it can be kind of in the middle and able to, and it defines what we think is acceptable. It's also part of a massive transhuman vision for the world that that is expressed, for example, by Michael Hauskeller, who's a philosopher and one of the leading futurists and transhumanists. He's got a book recently called Sex and the Post-Human Condition. And it's based on the idea that the singularity is coming. You know, that moment when the machines get smarter and faster and better than us, and we become maybe friends and lovers, but maybe there comes a point when we're dispensable, and human meat is gotten rid of in favor of silicon-based life forms, quote unquote. That's a rather nervous moment for the human race, but he says, don't worry, they'll be your children anyway, it's okay. And this is how he predicts it. We, or our successors, will finally be able to realize all our dreams here on Earth in this life, where there is no longer anything that would stand in the way of human, or rather post-human, fulfillment. We will finally be like gods. Where have you heard that before? Immortal, all-knowing, all-powerful, and perhaps most important, unimaginably happy. And he says on the way to getting there, we will be super intelligent, but we have to kind of understand that we have an instrumental body. The body is kind of evolution's way of building a consciousness, and that we can then bounce off and get into the next incarnation, or not incarnation, but next life as a machine, or as an intelligence, a robot. And he says you have to have an instrumental understanding of the body, and get this, you have to be willing for the conceptual transformation of your sexual partner into a masturbation device. It wasn't the preacher that said that, trying to mock this stuff. This is from one of the leading thinkers. The transformation of the sexual partner into a masturbation device. And he goes on to say that will discover that what had previously passed for passionate sex has been merely a mildly agreeable piece of foreplay. Erotic pleasure of an intoxicating intensity that mortal flesh has never known will thereafter be enjoyable with a whole gamut of friends and lovers. This will be possible because jealousy, already transiently eliminable today under the influence of various serotonin-releasing agents, is not the sort of gene-inspired perversion of consciousness likely to be judged worthy of conservation in the new era. You don't need jealousy, because pair bonding and love and making children together is so old hat, that's so human, and we're beyond that now. We're super intelligences in this scenario. And what exactly does great sex consist in? Not in, say, a more complete bodily and spiritual communion with another human being, but simply in the attainment of more intense pleasures and the ability to enjoy those pleasures to the greatest possible extent, my word, without any internal or external constraints. That is why we should use all possible means to increase the intensity of pleasure and to get rid of obstacles to pleasure, such as jealousy. He talks about in the 22nd century, when we're facing indefinite lifespans, tweaks to our biological gender will become increasingly common to stay in fashion, to improve our chances in life or in love, or just out of curiosity. Why stop with just a cosmetic enhancement or swapping your genitals for those of another sex when you could have a penis with the responsiveness of a clitoris or some entirely new sexual organ? The possibilities will be endless. Here's the sad bit. He emphasizes it will all make masturbation a lot easier and ultimately preferable. He says, faced with the uncertainty and security risk of letting some new person into your head versus just thumbing your own button, many people may opt for the life of single self-stimulation. Real body sex will then be about as exciting as stirring tepid tea with your finger. The only intimacy left here is the intimacy that we share with ourselves, or perhaps not even that, if intimacy involves closeness and a certain degree of self-awareness and being with. In any case, the overall message is that real bodies are better avoided. And he responds to the view that some people say, well, isn't that a bit soulless? And he actually says, does the fact that machines cannot not love and serve us, that they will never leave us and will always appear welcoming and loving, actually make sex bots superior to real human lovers? Does it give them the soul that we crave for, but we rarely find in humans? So get that, machines are better than humans because they can't leave us. They can't leave us. And he talks about the paradoxical idea that a doll or machine, which is unconscious and unfeeling, and in this sense does not have a soul, is in fact the truly soulful one, whereas real human lovers who do have a mind of their own and who do feel and do care appear to be lacking a soul. This renders them less desirable as a lover than a machine, which, although unfeeling, may appear to be more feeling than they. He talks about how you can use technology to have distant sex, teledildonics, with someone that you know or like or something. And he says, but that will gradually fade away. The surrogate was no longer needed or wanted. They become less and less important until they're gone completely. Finally, free to think only of ourselves, we will, after all, be able to enjoy sex with the person we know best and love most, ourselves. And one of his fans writes in and says, you can't get any better than that. I think you can get a lot better than that. It's called love, and it includes sex. But more on that later. Without sounding like a grumpy old Luddite, I must say that I've heard this before. In 1999, Ray Kurzweil wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, and he predicted that by last year, 2019, the all-enveloping, highly realistic, visual, auditory, tactile, virtual environment will be a viable competitor to the real thing, offering sensations that are more intense and pleasurable than conventional sex, as well as physical experiences that currently do not exist. He also said a $1,000 computer would be better than the human mind. And I haven't been able to buy one of those yet. If you know where to, please let me know. So we might be wise to treat some of these predictions like we treat, well, like a lot of people treat the predictions of evangelists. Listen, keep an open mind, but don't bet the farm. Because there's a famous sign that was above the desk of one of the MIT researchers, and it was a variation on the old civil rights slogan of "We shall overcome," and it said, "We shall overclaim." I think it's fair to say that the hype around technology has been, at times, unbelievable. John Danaher in Robot Sex says the visions of science fiction authors and movie makers are still beyond the horizon. And in a really useful document, the report from the Foundation for Responsible Robotics, Sharkey and his colleagues say the reality is considerably different And current sex robots, and even those on the drawing boards at the moment, are essentially mechanized sex dolls with limited expressiveness and minimal conversational capacities. So before they really become human lovers, we'll have to see the rise of general artificial intelligence. And don't be betting on that happening anytime soon. Some leading robotics professors that I've interviewed would say it will never happen. It will never happen. So let's have a look at what is actually going on now. You've seen some of the pictures of the dolls, and we could go into a lot of detail. To sum it up, their physicality is improving all the time. They're becoming more and more like people. For example, you can put pressure on their erogenous zones, hips, breasts, mouth, crotch, or hands, and arouse the robot, supposedly. It will then begin to moan and begin to engage in dirty talk using software similar to voice-activated systems like Siri. The Harmony doll, which is created by Abyss Creations, also called Real Dolls, they're famous, by the way. They've been on 20 different television shows and about 10 different films. So they're just brilliantly marketed. And they're getting better and better all the time. One alarming thing is another brand called Roxy offers a range of personality settings that you can put onto the doll. And that really just means how she responds sexually, or parasexually, if you like. But one of the personalities is called Frigid Farah. And if you like resistance or rape scenarios, she's perfect, because it's said that, you know, if you put your hand on her private parts, she won't thank you, and you really have to push to get what you want. More on that later. There are many more robot companies: Suzy Software and Harry Hard Drive, Candy Girl in Japan, Doll Suite in China, TPE Hit Doll and Silicon Z1 Doll in China. Russia has Anatomical Doll, Germany has Mecha Doll, France Dream Doll, and in the US there are about 4 other companies I haven't mentioned. It looks like being a really big industry. There are also doll brothels springing up across Europe and North America. Lumi dolls in Barcelona, for example. They're called sex doll brothels because advertising, you can't really call them robots if they don't have full AI or AI. And I love the comment from one of the local sex workers associations there in Barcelona, where they say this: they're not a threat to our profession. They do not communicate. They do not listen to you or caress you. They do not comfort you or look at you. They do not give you their opinion. The sex doll optimist, David Levy, Dr. David Levy, who's written a book called Love and Sex with Robots, and is very involved in the conferences to do with robotic sex. He claims sexbot brothels will meet the needs of Johns or clients, especially those who've not found human partners. And they'll often offer sexual variety without complications. And he says, actually, they'll end sex trafficking. That's a big call. And other scholars say he doesn't have any evidence really for that. Nick Pritchard, a reporter, went along to one of the sex brothels, and doll brothels, and he reported that the room stank of latex, the doll was glass-eyed, more like the horror puppet Chucky than Belle de Jour. She was heavy when I tried to move her. Her fingers stick out at odd angles, and at one point her wig pops off. It's utterly depressing. Can this really be someone's idea of kinky fun? He says, my encounter is as far removed from real human contact as it's possible to get. Sex has never been further from my mind. So I politely make my excuses and leave. That was his take on the experience on offer at a sex doll brothel. So I'd say their physical natures will just get better and better and better. Technology we can do. Control, robotics, AI, we're getting very good at that. The control side of things, no problem. And technology will just advance as the market advances. But in terms of talk, well, all I need to say is my kids are always entertained when they talk to Siri. It takes them a minute to get underneath her programming and find the glitches and make her say silly things and type in funny things that she has to say and make her repeat herself. And it's so easy to do that. As one writer said, voice computing has a long way to go. Machine conversation has a long way to go. There is certainly no sign of anything like the Scarlett Johansson character in the movie Her. And what about empathy and the ability to relate? Well, let's be fair. The last decade has seen a great leap forward in facial expressions on robots designed to convince us that they're feeling emotion. And the substances and some have even mimicked the muscles under human faces and tightened things under there. So they get that very human looking illusion. So that's one side. As far as their side goes, researchers are also pioneering systems so that they can classify how our faces show emotion. And robots can map our faces and have different grids in mind, programmed by some very, very smart people. And they're able to kind of read smiles or frowns or things like that. But they cannot yet really read the subtleties. They can't really get past some of what it might mean. So if they see tears, does that mean you're really happy? Or does that mean that you're sad? Or is there some relief or stress? Or who knows? They can also monitor our heart rates and breathing and sweat to test our arousal, but they don't know what kind of arousal it is, sexual, fear, etc. So Sharkey and colleagues conclude, we still don't fully understand how human emotion works, chemically, hormonally, or neurally. And we have no idea how to create genuine feelings in an artifact. So this is not worth considering for now. We do not contemplate or speculate about far future robots with personhood, but focus on the foreseeable future. Making a robot that can relate well may well exceed the capacity of technology for a long time to come. We have no idea to go about this, and so it remains entirely futuristic and speculative. Now, some psychology studies are showing that human beings can relate to robots as we relate to other technological devices. For example, marketing studies on how we love our cars and so on. And they say we can feel for a robot, but almost normally, a normal person usually knows that they can't really love us back. We might pretend, we might fantasize, but they can't really love us back. And the ethicist John Sullins says it feels a bit one-sided and could disrespect human freedom. Robots shouldn't be used to fool people into ascribing more feelings to the machine than they should. Love is a powerful emotion and we're easily manipulated by it. He says robot relationships would discount the deep and nuanced notions of love and the concord of true friendship. Even though they may be physically attractive, they would not satisfy our emotional needs. I think that's a pretty good summary. If you want a masturbatory aid that's physically beautiful, porn star quality and technically getting better all the time, that's what they are. If you want intimacy or friendship or even genuine conversation, you would have to have a very active imagination. The philosopher Charles S. says that since the machines are incapable of real emotions, they are simply faking it, no matter how persuasively. And the question is, do you want a relationship with someone or something that is faking it? The question answers itself. S describes an ideal sexual encounter that is marked by the full presence and engagement of persons as autonomous, self-aware, emotive, embodied, and unique. That's a great list. Autonomous, self-aware, emotive, embodied, and unique. And I'd add a few more to that list, but I think that's a very good start. And there are a few what we might call human concerns about contemporary robotics and sex robotics in particular. The first one is isolation and loneliness. Interestingly, there's no experimental data, but many scholars believe sex robots could lead to isolation, as the Futurama clip kind of joked about. Sullins says these machines will not help their users form strong friendships that are essential to an ethical society and may indeed lead to more isolation. Richardson says intimate relationships with robots will lead to more isolation for the human race because robots are not able to meet the species-specific sociality of human beings. Other humans only can do that. Sherry Turkle suggests that real sexual relationships could become overwhelming because relationships with robots were easier. Snell thinks robot sex could become addictive, and then non-human relationships could isolate users from human society. There are many more comments like that. Lee, in his book on defending robot sex, says, would it be pushing too far to argue that if someone can show empathy for a machine, they're more likely to show empathy for a human being? But the question is, how do you show empathy for the feelings of a machine when you know logically that it doesn't have any? It doesn't have a mental state, let alone an emotional one. While there's no empirical data on sex robots and social isolation, there may be something to learn from other contexts where non-sex robots are employed. For example, Robbins and colleagues discuss how robots can be isolators or mediators for children with autism. They basically show that some children with autism find robots connect them to other people, kind of through the robot, but others find that the robot keeps them in their own little world even more so. And they suggest, well, there may be a parallel there with how humans go. There's also the case that some would argue that robots should be able to teach people skills of interactions with other humans. There's a British medical journal article by Joseph Parrell who argues that individuals with disabilities, for example, have a right to all the sexual adventures and opportunities that the rest of the population has. But as a psychotherapist, Federica Fatchen and colleagues in another British medical journal writing argue, therapeutic use of sex robots is based on a mechanical view of sexuality. Sexual dysfunction depends on interactions between physical, psychological, socio-cultural, and relational factors. Sexual activity with robots is a masturbatory practice. So someone with sexual dysfunction, which already leads to isolation, might become even more isolated by the illusion of having a substitute satisfaction. Robots have no empathy or relationship skills. They can only fake them. And current perceptions of users say things like this: men whose loneliness, bad experiences with women, or social void, sexually and spiritually, have driven them to enter into an unconventional, unorthodox form of lifelong companionship, life with a doll. It's regarded as living on the outskirts of normality, but the men find a profound attachment and comfort and joy in the dolls. Maybe they do, but they don't seem to want then to connect with other people, and that may be quite indicative. At a time when we've got major loneliness as an epidemic in society, polls find that 18 to 24-year-olds are 4 times as likely to feel lonely most of the time compared with people in their 70s. And there are a lot of alarming trends. The number of Americans who responded that they felt lonely regularly jumped from the range of 11% and 20% in the 70s and 80s to now 45% by 2010. And European studies are suggesting similar outcomes. In a very witty book, Barak Lurie says this: with whom do you share your greatest fears? With whom can you share that great song or movie? Who do you try out that idea for a business? With whom can you just be yourself? The feeling that you complete each other, that you might need each other. It's the feeling that you might even become a better you with this other person, that you're going on a journey with this person into the future. You might participate with them in the creation of something great. And for couples who plan to have kids, they plan for future generations. So why doesn't everybody pursue it? Perhaps it's because they don't have relationship models to pursue in the first place. Maybe they'd rather spend time alone with themselves. It's easier after all. But either way, they don't even know what they're missing. More darkly, another human concern would be that of violence and abuse. If you've watched Westworld, you know that many of the robots there are subjected to violence and to sexual violence. I hate that phrase. It should be an oxymoron. Sexual violence. There's nothing sexy about violence. But in that show, it's an all too common scenario that people coming to the Westworld, to the park, want to experience. And in the real world, Bella Dolls of Vancouver promise on their website an experience like no other, where you are in complete control. Forget the restrictions and limitations that comes with a real partner and unleash with Bella Dolls. And their PR director, Ali Chan, said in interview about they let customers do what they want. She said, we're not supporting violence, but we're also saying that you can't use this service because you're aggressive. At the end of the day, they're just dolls. Now, you might say, if you're a decent person, is there really an appetite for violence out there in a sexual context in the community? Perhaps porn studies give us an answer, an insight into that. Anna Bridges, an American researcher, and her colleagues conducted an analysis of the 50 most popular porn movies, according to sales and rental lists in the US. And they found that nearly 90% of scenes contained physical aggression. Spanking and gagging and visible obstruction of breathing were the most popular, both featuring in approximately 1/3 of scenes. 1 in 7 scenes featured open hand slapping, 1 in 10 hair pulling. And about 1 scene in 15 is that sexual maneuver known as choking that forms such an essential part of the erotic repertoire. One character would place his or her hands around another character's throat with applied pressure. Almost half of the scenes showed verbal aggression in the form of name calling using words such as bitch or slut. And as these labels have already hinted, guess who were the recipients in 94% of all these acts of aggression? Women. Women were. And in Bridges' study, gagging was about 3 times more frequent than all that quaint old-fashioned stuff such as kissing, laughing, embracing, compliments, or caresses put together. It's a shocking insight into what the market is. And what about rape? Well, if Frigid Farah from the Roxy website is anything to go by, and the website says if you touch her in a private area, more than likely she will not be appreciative of your advance, that would be a signal of non-consent. And for a user to enjoy pushing past that would seem to be conditioning that user to be just that, a user, conditioning them for a crime of rape. Computers cannot give consent, and so technically, legally, they cannot be raped. Aha, great loophole. But they're not people with a will, but they can be used for simulations and rehearsals. And so the concern here for me is not what's happening to the machine, but what's happening to the user. After much discussion of the realistic robot rape scenarios in Westworld, Lynn observed, if it's important to society that we teach people that sex requires consent, then it's not absurd to build in these norms in human-robot interaction. We're socially conditioning people to act in better ways. It's a nice thought, but the question is, how do you actually do it in a robot? Sharkey and others explore the idea of using a courteous request before the robot's vagina will open. That seems a bit crass and mechanical, but it's an attempt. They also consider having a handle roughly sensor in their machine, something like a tilt sensor on a pinball machine, I guess. Although this seems to miss the fact that some people do enjoy vigorous, though not rough, treatment. They also acknowledge that perhaps this misses the point that rape is often about power and control and taking pleasure in debasing and humiliating victims. An obliging sex robot is unlikely to fulfill these kind of rapist desires. Peters and Hazelager, one of them from the University of Wollongong, suggest that robots could be built in with a consent module that either requires a man, and it is usually a man, to communicate carefully about the kind of interaction that will take place. First problem, how do you communicate carefully with a robot? And this could potentially result in the robot sometimes not consenting. Sounds really good. And they say this might negatively affect the potential economic gains of sex robot producers, and that's not our main concern. They don't care about crass things like marketing. They're ideal, but perhaps a bit too idealistic, because what do you think happens then? A guy's bought or hired this robot and it says no, what's he going to do? And what does that then train him to do? They talk about virtuous sex robots. But the problem is, well, there's a number of problems. First of all, a lot of consent is based on non-verbal cues. Verbal cues can be confused by the social pressure and substance abuse issues. And both men and women, according to research, believe that obtaining verbal consent might lower their chances of getting sex later. They hope that these virtuous sex robots will change the culture in that regard. To be honest, it feels very, very idealistic to me. The scholar Gutiu comes up with a much more radical solution. She sees the robot as an ever-consenting sexual partner, and the user has full control of the robot and the sexual interaction. By circumventing any need for consent, sex robots eliminate the need for communication, mutual respect, and compromise in the sexual relationship. The use of sex robots results in the dehumanization of sex and intimacy by allowing users to physically act out rape fantasies and to confirm rape myths. Of the greatest concern is how sex robots will affect men's ability to identify and understand consent in sexual relations with real women. And so there's a group of people that are part of a campaign to ban sex robots on feminist and human rights kind of grounds. Excuse me. Some have suggested too that sex robots could provide therapy, or at least an alternative target for crimes like pedophilia, rape, and violent sex. Most people cringe at the thought of child sex robots, but they have been marketed globally for a dozen years by a Japanese company called Trottler. And get this, it was founded by Shin Takag, who is a pedophile. Takag told The Atlantic in 2016, "We should accept that there is no way to change someone's fetishes. I am helping people express their desires legally and ethically. It's not worth living if you have to live with repressed desires." And a bunch of scholars come in and say, yes, that'd be great. Let's give it to pedophiles. In fact, let's prescribe it for pedophiles and mean that they have to do that. They have to do that rather than act out on real children. May sound good on first blush. Actually, it sounds terrible to most people. But the first problem is that really the only two options that a pedophile has, either act out or use a robot? Is there not are there not other options open to them? And Lin says, treating pedophiles with robot sex children is dubious and repulsive. Imagine treating racism by letting a bigot abuse a brown robot. If expressing racist feelings is a cure for them, then we wouldn't see much racism in the world. He argues the ethics of sex robots go well beyond whether anyone is physically harmed. There are other issues at stake: moral character, psychological effects. It's not as simple an issue as some people think. And also this view seems to see desire as an appetite, like hunger or thirst, which can be satisfied and go away. But Futchin and his colleagues say in the British Medical Journal, this is a misunderstanding of sexual violence and assumes that rapists and pedophiles are motivated by the need to satisfy sexual urges. Such a reductionist perspective trivializes the complexity of sexual violence, which involves issues of dominance and psychological manipulation. Robots do not suffer. This also seems to ignore the insights of neuroplasticity, such as Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, which suggests that our sexual and other habits of mind can change as we exercise them or not. Perhaps the best quote is Peter Fagan from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, who cites cognitive behavioral therapy. And as a paraphilia researcher, he believes that contact with Trottler's products, these child sex dolls, would likely have a reinforcing effect on pedophilic ideation, and in many instances cause it to be acted upon with greater urgency. God help us. So I don't think that's the kind of use that we want these dolls to be put to. These are some of the concerns then floating around about sex dolls. The question then is, will the market want them? I'd say that some of the blockers currently are cost. The best ones retail at about 15,000 US, and also social perception. People will think you're a bit of a friendless nerd if you're seen or known to be seen, but if you're known to be using a sex robot. But in a very witty book, Barak Lurie, published earlier this year, Barak Lurie claims sex robots will be a marketing phenomenon. And although he doesn't like them, he's a very ethical Jewish thinker, sympathetic to Christian ideas as well. But he says this: men will see the advantages. Robots won't accuse you of sexual harassment or rape. They won't judge you or complain in any way. They won't give you a disease or an unwanted child or demand custody after having that child. They will do whatever you say. They won't get older, fatter, or uglier on you. And you'll soon see many men asking one simple question: where do I sign? And Lurie's obviously satirizing people's attitudes there. He actually sees sex as a gift of God for the purpose of bonding one man with one woman and for making children, and thus a family and a society. And he says, I believe that most people innately understand the power of sex, that it is indeed a spiritual gift. But we don't want to listen to that inner voice. We shoo it away. We'd rather abuse it just to satisfy the sexual impulse with quick and often meaningless physical hookups. But he says that male lust for beauty is what will compel this. He says these sex dolls are beyond the ordinary man's wildest dreams. And he says if you doubt that sex robots will dominate the market, perhaps you should go back to 1978 and try to estimate the size of a home computer market based on the use of calculators. He says that'll become huge. Now, I'm happy to remain agnostic on that. I hope it doesn't. We've got enough dehumanizing, decivilizing forces going on. But even if it does, I would argue that there will always be a perceptual awareness that it's not a real person. You may want to use it as a physical-only masturbatory aid. It may have some Siri level or slightly better conversation, but it will not genuinely interact with you. It will not call forth all of your humanity into a relationship like another person hopefully does. And one problem is what they call, to put it another way, it won't always pass the sexual Turing test. You remember Turing, the great World War II code cracker and arguably inventor of one of the first physical calculating machines. So in a sense, the father of the computer. His test was that a robot would be able to fool you 30% of the time by communication, either spoken or on-screen communication, that it was human. It could have a conversation with you. These robots, I think, will not pass the Turing test until and unless the human race is able to crack general artificial intelligence. And that Turing test, I think, even if robots are selling like crazy and physically very realistic, I think that will always tell us that they're not fully human. And I think, for example, of a writer called Christopher Trout, who goes around testing these kinds of things. And he goes to the Harmony factory of real dolls. And he says, when he flipped the switch on Harmony's external processing unit and I was transported to a place I never imagined I'd be, the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is a 1970s term made up by a Japanese robotics professor called Mori. And he noticed the phenomenon that when robots get more and more and more human, people get more and more affinity with them. They emotionally identify with them. They speak to them more. They kind of almost want to believe that they're becoming or that they already are sort of semi-human. But he notices that that only works to a point. And when they get to the 80-85% mark of human, that's when people start to go, oh, and find them really eerie and uncanny and freaky and a bit off-putting, and oh, it freaks me out. There are various theories about this. Some would say it's because they then remind us of a person with something wrong, a person with a mental illness, because somehow their speech doesn't quite match their facial gestures, or that doesn't quite match their other gestures, or we somehow get a vibe that they're a bit, that they're close to a human and a weird human at that. And so the uncanny valley kind of kicks in. There's been a lot of study about this in trying to overcome it. And he notices that the real dolls, he talks to McMullen, the designer, and he says he's gone out of his way to avoid the uncanny valley by giving his dolls larger, rounder eyes and more symmetrical faces than are humanly possible. So he's noticed that the designers at Real Doll are saying, man, we don't want to fall into the uncanny valley and put people off. So we'll make these dolls really cartoony and very, we won't try to be hyper realistic. We'll just be kind of more playful and stylized. But even so, the uncanny valley, I mean, that might solve the problem on a physical level. But the uncanny valley also works on a psychological, emotional, relational, human antennae vibes kind of level. Okay, where you can tell that Siri isn't really a person and isn't really talking to you. And I think that will always stay with us. It may not affect the sales of sex robots, but I think even if they go gangbusters, people will always know that there's an uncanny valley there and they're not really human. Sherry Turkle, a great commentator on this area, says, the primary component is a feeling of togetherness or the absence of loneliness. It's companionship, or a feeling that we are being with, talking to, sitting with, making love with, and the person that we're with understands how we feel and empathizes with us. She also, and so the uncanny valley can come in there pretty hard. Why do I make a thing out of that? I think it will always be a witness to us that these are not at our level psychologically and intellectually. There's a consciousness in us that is not in them. Even if they become the best sellers of the next generation, with all the effects that that could have on human character and human relationships, I think we'll know that. And I think that's important because it demonstrates to us something that's valid, which I'll now discuss as we come to finish with theological concerns. So some of the theological concerns about sex robots. First of all, Jalil and Tijani, some Islamic scholars, found that having intercourse with a robot is unethical, immoral, uncultured, a slap to the marriage institution, and shows disrespect for a human being. They said that under Sharia law, it would be adultery for a married person and they would be subject to stoning to death. And that for a single person, they would receive 100 lashes for fornication. Marriage to a robot would be forbidden as marriage to an animal or someone of the same sex. That's pretty clear. We could also, more broadly, remember Martin Buber's description of how people can either take an I-you or an I-it approach to others and to the world. And it matters because it won't affect just how you treat them, but it'll affect who you are. Buber says the I of the basic word I-you is different from that in the basic word I-it. So if I'm treating you like an it, that changes me, and not for the better. The psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen, who interestingly has a more famous cousin, Borat. Simon Baron-Cohen, though, the Cambridge psychologist, expert in autism, he observes that it is the lack of empathy which underlies much of human cruelty. And this involves seeing people as objects and thus changing ourselves so that we come to relate only to things or to people as if they were just things. I think there's a lot of psychology and theology in that may wipe out much interest in sex robots for oneself. There's also a great chapter by Noreen Hertzfeld in Danaher and MacArthur's new book, just a couple of years old. And she talks about a religious critique of robotic sex. She starts with a shocking verse from Ezekiel 16, where she says, "You also took the fine jewelry I gave you, and jewelry made of my gold and silver, and you made for yourself male idols, and you prostituted yourselves with them." She accepts that that's a rereading of that text. That wasn't what Ezekiel had in mind, but it starts her analysis with a pretty striking kind of shock to me, anyway. Then she quotes Humanae Vitae, the Pope's encyclical on love and sex, and it describes sex as wholly within the context of love, a love that is freely given, based on trust, exclusive, and meant not only to survive the joys and sorrows of daily life, but also to grow so that husband and wife become, in a way, one heart and one soul, and together attain their human fulfillment. And then she pulls that apart and says, well, would a robot be capable of exclusivity when anybody can turn it on? Would a robot be capable of giving love freely? Could it say no or choose someone else? And she points out that to have someone or something under complete control is completely incompatible with wanting a relationship with it. And I would say that even God himself didn't make that mistake in the human race, that he made us in his image with dignity. He made us his covenant partners, and that confers on us dignity and honor and agency. An agency that is in a robot. When God says in Deuteronomy, if you do this, and things like choose life, I think God is suggesting that we have agency and the ability to decide to be in covenant with him or not, at least at one level. And I know there are varying views on that within Christianity, but at least at one level, I think we'd see that there's human agency, and that's important. Whereas there is no mutuality of consent, and this lack of mutuality limits the self-giving within the relationship. The robot has no choice but to give. I'd follow John Lennox in his recent book, 2084, looking at AI. He goes back to Genesis a lot, and I think there's a lot of value. And just very briefly, let me sketch for you some of the, I think, relevant concepts from those early chapters of the scriptures. Number one is the statement we've already heard, you will be as gods. Elon Musk calls humans the biological bootloader for a digital superintelligence. Ray Kurzweil, who actually pioneered the idea of the singularity or nerd rapture, as it was called, was asked whether there is a God, and he replied, well, I would say not yet. And you can see these techno-futurists trying with silicon to rebuild the Tower of Babel, so that whose top reached under heaven. But I still think God comes down to us. He comes down to us in kindness. He comes down to us as he did to the first guilty couple. And the first thing he does is to condescend, to come to try to find us. Second thing he does is to call to us and try to say, hey, humans, I'm over here. And only then does he talk about our problems and our guilt. Only after he's shown great condescension and a seeking after us, kind of a shepherd's heart, you might say. Secondly, the concept that God made man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his face the breath of life. And he became a living nephesh, a living soul, we sometimes say. But it's a much more holistic word. He became a living, a person, a life form, a totality of human existence. I think one of the major problems with the post-human concepts and with a lot of robotic sex is inadequate anthropology. It doesn't actually really know what a human being is. It knows that we're made from the dust of the earth, our physical side, and that's valid and beautiful. But some super post-human futurists want to get rid of that and just abandon the physical as not very useful long term. Others want to, give it all the pleasure that they can. But many of them don't take into account the other side of a person, the breath of life, whatever that is. The complex, amazing, unable to describe human soul and spirit. That is so obvious that it's there, but it doesn't show up in many tests at all. The third concept might be, by the way, on that nephesh thing too, the Song of Songs then picks up that word, and the lovers in that idealized piece of erotica say to one another, tell me, you whom my nephesh loves, where will you be today? In other words, that book is based on a whole person model of love, body, mind, spirit, all engaged in interacting with the other, loving them. And I think that's the biblical ideal. Thirdly, the concept that Adam knew his wife. It's so simple to say it. Adam knew his wife. The Hebrew word yada, to know in the most intimate and tender way. And that knowledge was mental, emotional, physical, every part of a person. How is this possible if your machine lover has no mental state? You can't know them, they can't know you. The porn scholar Linda Williams says, if true interactivity is to be defined as communication with the difference and unpredictability of the other, as opposed to interaction with the sameness of oneself, the interaction of a, pardon the French, piece of arse in a software package would seem to be the height of solipsism. Solipsism is the view that only the self exists and can be known. I think, therefore I am, but I'm not too sure about you. Okay, that's solipsism. And it has come to mean isolation, self-centeredness, and selfishness. I think that's the major issue. She's nailed it there, of porn as well, actually. Whereas a real sex partner might surprise you, the woman on the screen has no independent agency. The paradox would seem to be that the greater the simulation of the agency of the other, the more the real thing and the real sense of the other is missing. But Adam knew his wife, Eve. She was also flesh of his flesh, not just silicon. And they became one flesh at every level, even down to the genetic level, which, if that's the deepest part of a human, they were able to join their genes and make little humans together. Wow. That's mysterious, Paul says in Corinthians, and amazing. Also, be fruitful and multiply. I kid you not, there is a chapter called Can Robots and Humans Make Babies Together? It's by Dr. David Levy, who, let's just say, isn't shy to give things a go. He begins by saying this is not a joke, and he tries to argue that one day there could be a genetic robot which derives from human DNA, and it might be able to interact with human cells and reproduce. Maybe pigs might fly. It's about that realistic, to be honest. But really, the profound and amazing mystery of human reproduction belongs to, at least biologically, to two people. And for all the attempts to change that with high-tech methods, that still seems to be the basic default option. And as I said before, Genesis also has a creator who comes and finds us and says, where are you? It's a great question to ask, I think, at this day and age. Then deals with our guilt and shame and redeems us and gives us love and hope. And I think that's massively important. There are many other theological or biblical concepts one could use. The idea of looking lustfully being equivalent to already committing adultery in your heart. How much more would that be true of some 3D creation in silicon? Paul's comment about the person who joins himself to a prostitute, joins himself, kalao, I think is the Greek word, meaning to glue, to stick yourself to somebody. There are profound bonds, it seems, in the sexual act. And he says, why would you do that with someone that you don't even know? You really ought to be bonding yourself to God in your spirit and be one in spirit. There's a theological answer of what are we here for? What's the purpose of us? Is it really just pleasure, as the post-humanists would have us believe? If the prayer book's right, then man's chief end is to know God and to enjoy him forever. Or as Jesus put it, to love God and love your fellow man is a summary of the entire law. So if that's the case, then we are very relational beings. And I think just an onanistic response to technology is not where we want to be. We want to be using sex to connect to our lifelong partner, marital partner. And also it seems like that's God's original intention. I can't resist adding that I think there are two great apologetical arguments that could be based on this whole area. And I've tried to do so in a film which will be screened tonight, your time, Saturday night. The first one is an argument from design. The more I've read about attempts to simulate touch, for example, the more you learn about the incredible complexity of just touching somebody, what that means, the interactions that go on, and all the levels of which that happens. The human body, let alone the human mind, are incredibly complex. The more we try to imitate it, the more it jumps out that they are the work of a master designer. And I think that argument can be made again and again and again. Secondly, I think you can also base here an argument from consciousness for the existence of God. The fact that the human mind still towers above the greatest of robots and AI because we are conscious and they're not, to me, needs an explanation. And you have atheists, such as Thomas Nagel in his fantastic book, Mind and Cosmos, saying that both of those things, design of the human body and the rest of nature, and also the existence of consciousness, require an explanation which his atheism cannot give. And I think that's a very important opportunity for the presentation of the Christian faith. I'll leave the last word to Barak Lurie. He says this: we've taken the humanity out of sex, not realizing that its central purpose was creation and bonding, not realizing that sex was an exercise of free will. So from all of this, we come to one simple conclusion. We have become the robots. We are the sex machines that we fear. We're content, he says, generalizing about Western culture, to enjoy sex at a merely robotic level. And if we do that, we'll miss out on a whole lot of experience and a whole lot of truths that would otherwise be apparent to us through God's great gift of sex. He goes on, there will be those who will not suffer this fate, those who will not only survive, but thrive. They will sidestep all of this madness. Who are these people? The followers of God among us. They will understand what sex has always been actually for, to do God's work, to heal the world, to help bring about joy and goodness, to perfect civilization, and to participate in creation. Nothing else makes sense. Nothing else but the return to the centrality of God will. Nothing else will bring the humanity and the purpose back into sex. I will look forward to your questions and comments when we get to Zoom later. And thank you very much for listening this far.